Well, my name is Karline Tierney. I was born Karline Kennan, Koenen was my maiden name. And I was born in Auburn, New York, which is a little bit west of Syracuse.
Oh, great. And tell me about your family background, including any ethnic background that you might want to share.
Well, the ethnic part that I'm most aware of, my grandfather emigrated from Germany when he was in his late teens. And in fact, I have his immigration papers. And my grandmother and grandfather were the closest geographic relatives that we had, except that was on my father's side. And my mother's family had an Irish-English mixture background and must have come much, much earlier to the United States. And my mother's family lived in Seneca Falls and Waterloo. And when she was a year old, her father died. And she lived between two grandmothers, one in Waterloo, one in Seneca Falls. And I recall her telling me they would pin a little note on her and put her on the train and say, put her off in Waterloo or put her off in Seneca Falls.
Amazing.
And she lived between her grandmothers.
Isn't that a story?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I don't think it was all that uncommon for that time. I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah. So, what else would you like to say about them? How did they help you become the woman you are?
Well, my mother was a determined person, and her goal from the day we were born was, you must go to college. That's the most important thing for you. And so we grew up with that expectation. But, you know, in those days, you either had the money to go to college or you did not. Or you did not go. I mean, it was purely simple. So we were very much not only was it the Depression when you had to save and where nobody really had much of anything, but we were also very much influenced by her efforts to make sure, I can't get you a new dress because we're saving for college. And that was very much a big, major import in my family.
And that really shaped your life. Did you have a brother or sister?
I had a younger sister and an older sister.
Okay, 3 girls.
And I actually inherited the abilities and talents of my father more than my other 2 sisters did.
Interesting.
So that was what guided me toward chemistry when I was in high school, and I studied chemistry in college.
Okay, so you're a scientist. What was your life like before you got involved in the women's movement? How would you describe all that period before?
It was very traditional. I was married in 1949, and I had worked in Washington at the Office of Rubber Reserve. And I married another chemist who was also working there. And we had looked forward to having a family, and the family didn't appear. And we adopted 3 children in the 1950s. And, you know, I stayed home with my children, and I enjoyed cooking, and I enjoyed homemaking, and it was very traditional.
Right.
And in 1952, I joined the American Association of University Women. And I think at that time, AAUW was a wonderful outlet for married women staying at home, which was the normal way for married women to be at that time. And it was a great outlet for intellectual expression and learning and meeting people with your own interests and so on. And so that pretty much was typical of what I was doing in the 50s.
Right. So you stayed active in AAUW while you were raising your kids.
Right. Right.
Okay. Do you remember when you first became aware of the organized new women's movement?
I recall it because in 1965, my husband's work changed and we moved to Louisiana.
Oh.
And and I continued with activity with AAUW, and somewhere maybe 67 or so, Sylvia Roberts came to an AAUW meeting to tell us about the horrors of Louisiana law and the way those laws affected women, which, and I had not even thought about any laws anywhere or of any sort that affected women in any case. And certainly our eyes were opened to the really anti-female laws that existed in Louisiana.
Right.
And it was a community property state. Theoretically, you owned everything that your husband did, except that in Louisiana, he had the complete legal power. So although you owned your home, he could buy and sell your home without your signature or your agreement. So theoretically, the community property was not, you were not actually and factually able to control your so-called community property.
Right. Do you remember any of the other laws that Sylvia mentioned?
Well, the buying and selling of your home, credit of course was a serious issue. At that time, women could not get a credit card without their husband's signature. And the particular laws in Louisiana came and developed out of the community property laws, which were not typical for other states.
Right.
They were in some ways theoretically better, but operationally they were much worse.
Right.
And certainly credit was a big one. The laws governing divorce were highly prejudicial against women. And I don't know that I recall specific ones.
Right. So Sylvia came as a representative of NOW. She was probably the Southern Regional Director at that point.
Probably.
So how did that change I would say that you were involved in the women's movement through AAUW, so I won't ask you when you got involved because you obviously had been involved. But this changed your involvement, the Meeting a NOW person, did it?
Oh my, I was horrified because I recalled at the time when we moved, my husband had bought a home in Louisiana. I had not seen it until I moved there. And I remember him talking about it being a community property state. We both owned the home, and I remember thinking, how come I never signed anything? And
interesting.
Yeah, that's the way the community property worked at that time. But I don't recall Sylvia speaking about NOW. Now she may have.
Okay.
I'm sure that I joined NOW through her influence, although the person that I recall most influencing me with NOW was Roberta Madden.
So tell me what roles you played in NOW and the other organizations. In AAUW, were you an officer, or were you an active member? And then what happened when you joined NOW? And I know there are other organizations you want to talk about too.
Well, certainly most of my understanding of women's issues came from NOW.
Okay.
And AUW in Baton Rouge, unlike probably AAUW in maybe some of the northern communities, was a little bit mixed in their interest in the women's movement. Some people were very heavily interested. There were women in the Baton Rouge branch of AUW who expressed a feeling of being threatened. And one member expressed to me that she felt her life had not been worthwhile living it entirely as a homemaker. Where I responded differently, well, this is a new understanding of life and of family life and married life.
Right.
I didn't feel threatened by it.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, most of my understanding of women's issues came from NOW. And AAUW was evolving certainly at the same time. From its very origins, it was oriented toward equality for women in the field of education, but not so much broadly in society as NOW was.
Exactly, yeah.
And so we worked together. I think one of the more interesting projects that was a coordination of Baton Rouge NOW and AAUW. When I ran for director of women's issues in AAUW, now by that time I'd been branch president and branch state president and most of all legislative chair. My interest was definitely, having been sparked by Sylvia Roberts, was in legislation. When I was running to become director of women's issues in AAUW, which was a national position and a national campaign, that was when this little pamphlet.
Do you remember what year?
Pardon?
What year? We can look.
I'm going to say 72, but
okay, around 72.
I'm not sure. It was around then.
Right.
Oh, I don't think there's a date on there.
No.
But the most recent date in the pamphlet would have been the date that I was running. Whatever.
Well, your experience here goes through 82.
I went on the board of AAUW in 83.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that was when this campaign took place.
Okay, good. Right.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what issues were of greatest concern to you through the years? And maybe they changed over time, but...
Well, in Louisiana, because that's where I was at the time, certainly the laws that affected women were highly discriminatory. They were discriminatory over the nation, but they were even more so in many ways in Louisiana because it's being a community property state, and it was different from all other states in its treatment of women.
Louisiana has a different basis for their law, don't they? They instead of the British law, they have the French.
Yes.
So I
Yes.
sort of remember that from the discussions
Right.
at the time. So that may have shaped the laws differently.
Oh, it definitely did.
Okay.
Yes, they were. I'm trying to think of the name. Napoleonic Code. They came out of the Napoleonic
That's
Code.
right. That's right.
And it was highly regressive as far as women were concerned.
Right. Right.
Right.
So that you were very interested in the law's treatment of
Right.
women, and then I see over time that you played a role in the Equal Rights Amendment campaigns.
Well, actually, 72 when ERA passed Congress and went out to the states. Of course, all organizations now in AAUW were highly, highly motivated to begin working toward ratification.
Right.
And by that time, I was active in NOW and in AAUW, and I worked a great deal with Sylvia Roberts, who was an enormous inspiration.
Yes.
You know, she would give you suggestions. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Immediately, we would go out and do this or that, whatever it was.
Right.
So I certainly was very active in the formation of our coalition in Louisiana to ratify ERA.
Okay.
And the NOW chapter, of course, was very active with that, as was AAUW in a somewhat lesser role.
Mm-hmm.
But before the Equal Rights Passed Congress, the NOW chapter and AAUW worked on a little pamphlet. We were working on health issues at LSU. The NOW chapter was.
Okay.
And the NOW chapter was finding that female students at LSU did not have any information, nor were they encouraged nor allowed to get information on birth control or abortion or any women's health issues. So NOW took it upon itself to canvass the community and pull together a pamphlet of all the information that was available through clinics in Baton Rouge, where you could go in Baton Rouge for information. And I was able to obtain a project funding sum of money from AAUW, and NOW pulled all the information together, and together AAUW and NOW put together the pamphlet. I no longer have a copy of that.
Yeah.
But it was where women at LSU could go for information on any health issue.
Very helpful.
Which was not being provided by the university.
Right.
And so the grant from AAUW and the legwork from NOW put all of that together. So that was a pre-ERA effort where AAUW and NOW worked together.
Beautiful. Yes.
Yeah, so that was something that we were happy to do. Well, the founding, I worked with Sylvia Roberts in helping get the coalition together to ratify ERA, and she was primarily involved with the specific legal issues.
Right.
But she was very knowledgeable on all the groups in Louisiana, and would hook us up with organizations to contact. So she was behind the scenes doing that sort of work. And so...
What was it like to lobby the Louisiana legislature for the Equal
that
Rights
was
Amendment?
a fun thing, I want to tell you. That was an experience all by itself. I gave a whole speech on that to my college. Some of the professors at college had invited me to speak way after all of this, and that was one of the things they were interested in. Well, you understand that the legislature had approximately zero interest in equal rights for women.
Right.
And they believed this community property law took care of everything anyway. And they really did not want to see women on the floor of the legislature lobbying. That was totally unwelcome. And there were two of us. The first year, Linda Martin and myself were the only two people. We went every day and lobbied every day. When you were lobbying on the floor of the legislature, You were not allowed to wear slacks. If you lobbied and you were on the floor, you were in a dress. That was the rule. And they were perhaps somewhat intrigued by the ERA, but certainly not favorable to it.
Right.
And they had a million reasons why you had no need for it, and in Louisiana you are well, quote, taken care of. And we had some interesting experiences. I recall one legislator who said, if you convince my mother, I will vote for it. So I recall an assortment of people. By that time, we had a lot of people interested and a lot of people working in the background, and located neighbors and friends and relatives of his mother. And finally,
Amazing.
She was convinced that this was a really good thing, and she would speak to her legislator. So when, after all of that, and we approached him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know, but my mother isn't really, she doesn't really understand anyway." And so his mother became much less important
Right.
afterward than
When she disagreed with him.
Right.
Yeah.
She didn't agree with him.
Right.
So anyway, and we had a nun who was down river. I don't remember the little town, tiny little town south of Baton Rouge. And I don't recall how I met her, but she would come and lobby. The nuns at that time had given up the habit and were wearing ordinary clothes.
Right.
So there were people on the floor of the legislature. You might bring her and say, she's Sister so-and-so, and she works in whatever little town it was. And they would say, I recall one legislator saying, "Well, I like the nuns in the habits. If you bring me a nun in a habit, then I'll be glad to listen to her."
Amazing.
There were a million excuses.
Yes. How long were you in? When did you leave Louisiana? Were you in Louisiana this whole period?
Yes, we left Louisiana in 85.
Okay, so after the ERA had already been not ratified,
Correct.
unratified.
Correct.
Okay, so you were also active, as I understand it, in the National Women's Party at some point in your life.
Right. That developed out of the 72, 75 period. Elizabeth Chittick was president of the National Women's Party. And she came to Louisiana. I don't recall especially why she did. I don't know whether she had met me when I went on the AAUW board, like in 82, and I would be in Washington for those meetings. I don't recall the time I actually met Elizabeth, but she came down to lobby, and it was around that time that she invited me to join the board.
Okay.
That was an interesting experience all by itself.
I'm sure it was. Right. So, so obviously that speaks to your ability to get along with a lot of people with the variety of organizations. You obviously were able to work with the NOW people and the AUW people.
Oh, yeah.
That's excellent.
Well, I mean, my sense was we're all looking at the same goals.
Right, absolutely. What do you think were your major accomplishments personally and ones that you were also involved with in the women's work?
Well, the women's movement inspired me. It brought forth from me, or I shouldn't say reactivated. I had a desire to go back to work.
Okay.
And I recall from the work we did with NOW, the recognition that older women in the United States had no pensions, and that it was important for women to become employed and work toward obtaining a pension. And I had a desire to become employed, hopefully in chemistry, and mixed with all of this time period when we began working for the ratification of ERA, I had gone back to LSU to bring my chemistry up to date. My chemistry was 20 years out of date,
Right.
or thereabouts. And so I took chemistry courses to bring my chemistry up to date. And during those early years, the early 70s, I was also looking to become employed in the chemical industry.
Okay.
And that was an experience all by itself also.
Louisiana was a good place to be for that occupation,
Well, there were
right?
plenty of chemical plants, but there weren't plenty of women in them. And actually, the Civil Rights Act of 64 moved the large companies to begin looking for women. And I really had a lot of luck in that regard.
Excellent. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I applied for a position in a laboratory run by Rollins, the trucking company, but they also ran laboratories, and they had a little laboratory in the northern part of Baton Rouge. And I applied for a position in their laboratory, and they said, well, we have all women here, and that's the way we want to keep it. And they were clearly uninformed about the law and didn't really care.
Right.
And as a friend of Sylvia Roberts, I understood right away what that meant. And she said, put in a complaint to EEOC, which I did.
Oh.
EEOC came back and said, yes, you really should litigate this. So I employed Sylvia to litigate this. And I particularly recall that when the individual gave his deposition, him saying, but we had all men here, and that's the way we wanted to keep it.
Perfect.
Totally
Speak right into the microphone, right?
Totally uninformed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a very easily won lawsuit.
Amazing.
And
Good to do.
Unlike, the most prominent person recently who went through hell and high water and who has a law named for her,
Yes, the woman. Yes.
Anyway,
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
this was an easy lawsuit.
So you won. Did you go to work there?
No. They were forced to pay me a year's salary.
Okay.
That was very helpful.
Yes, good.
And I did ultimately, the lawsuit hung with me because there was an advertisement in the paper from Allied Chemical, and when I applied for that at the employment agency, I recall them taking note of the fact this person has already
Litigated.
filed a lawsuit. You got to be careful of her.
Right.
But the Allied Chemical they had 4 plants in Baton Rouge. One of them was very, very old and falling down.
Mm-hmm.
And they were getting ready either to sell it or abandon it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a shortage of chemical engineers at the time. They were having a hard time finding a chemical engineer because no one right out of college or looking for work wanted to go to work in this plant that was clearly falling down and getting ready to be sold.
Right.
So, but they needed people, and they also were under pressure to hire women because of the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
And that opened a door for me.
Okay.
And I was working in it was called a technical group. They wanted all engineers. They had an engineer in charge of the group, but there were 4 of us who were chemists.
Okay.
Because those were the people available.
Right. Okay.
And that was an interesting, but it gave me an opening
in your field.
In my field, yes, it was very helpful.
Gotcha,
and I actually went to work in '74 with Allied Chemical, and I was at that point I was heading the ERA coalition. League of Women Voters had installed a telephone in my home to use to call people all over the state. You know, we're talking with so-and-so legislator. He says he's not hearing from his constituents. Then at nighttime I would be calling the NOW members who were all over the state, and the NOW members and AAUW, but the NOW members more often were the backbone of the lobbying efforts.
Yeah.
And I would be doing that at night.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was
a busy time, wasn't it?
Right, yes.
Very
and I
busy.
went to work at Allied, and this was really extremely dirty work. League of Women Voters had a hotel room right near the Capitol, which they used for their meetings and discussions and one thing or another. And after I worked at Allied, I would go there and get all cleaned up and go on to lobbying at the Capitol.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was a busy time.
It was a busy time. What would you count as your most memorable and important experiences in a long activist time?
Was certainly lobbying for ERA. It was the most important.
Yeah.
Most important thing for women, and lots and lots of other issues, but we needed that so badly.
Right. I'll just ask you, how do you think the lobbying for the ERA affected other issues? In other words, we didn't get the ERA, but do you think we got something out of all that effort?
Oh, first of all, women were taught to lobby and the need for lobbying. And of course, when ERA failed, there was now a body of women, probably all through the country, who had learned to lobby, understood it, and immediately knew the issues that they had learned through the effort for ERA, and were able to continue. Although I do believe when ERA failed, every national organization connected with women that had worked for ERA had been bled dry.
Yes.
Energy, money, everything. And there was a general giving up.
You saw that right after the ERA.
Right.
At the end of the ERA. Do you think we've recovered from that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We're into a whole new world.
Right. We are, indeed.
Right.
So after the ERA campaign, after '82, you continued to be involved in women's issues. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that was primarily through AAUW.
Okay.
And I went on the AAUW board as chair of a national topic. AUW had topic chairs at that time. There were 4 topic chairs at a time, and I was asked to be chair of the 21st Century Deciding Now. That was a perfectly wonderful experience.
Right.
And I had a committee of members from all around the country, and at that time AAUW had influence and money, and were able to bring experts in, and we developed a national project for each branch to follow on the whole subject of futurism, and how personally and nationally and legislatively we needed to be looking to the future. And the committee that I chaired took as our topic the organizations and structures in society that governed women's lives had not been formed with participation by women, and that our goal for the 21st century was to change that.
Beautiful. Mm-hmm. That's very good.
And so we developed a whole program. That was a 2-year effort, and there was a chair in each state, and at the end there was a volume called The End Product of what each of the states and the branches had done during that time toward planning toward a 21st century that included women.
Excellent.
That was a great experience.
Excellent resource, yes.
Yeah, it was
for
wonderful.
everybody. Right, right.
Right, yeah,
Right.
and that afforded me the opportunity. I traveled all over the country.
Oh, that was fun.
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So you talked about now kind of, or being involved with the women's movement, inspiring you to go back to work in your field.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other ways in which you thought now, I mean, you obviously had a great impact on now, but are there other ways you'd like to talk about that now impacted your life? How did your life change because you were a now person
Well,
or an activist?
I certainly met a lot of wonderful people.
Right.
And the Now membership, unlike AAUW, was a very broad membership. And I remember, and I don't recall her name, but she was an iron worker, and I've forgotten the name. There's a title for that kind of job, which I've forgotten.
Right.
But anyway, there were some very wealthy women in Baton Rouge. I recall one person whose husband owned an insurance company. It was a much broader membership.
Interesting.
The head of the Women's Welfare Rights Committee was a member of Now, and it was a wonderful experience to meet the really broad membership of members of Now, and that was great. Clay Latimer.
Clay. Right.
That's who the name was. Who was?
I thought of the other name, Kim Gandy.
Oh, of course, of
Kim
course. Right.
Stuff
Yes,
like
Kim was in law school, and we used to go to all the Now conferences that were state meetings and regional meetings. And I recall we went to a regional meeting in Mississippi, and Now was a suspect organization, and there were, I'm saying FBI.
Somebody.
There were people,
Right.
always interested, and it was funny, because there was a man who came to every Now meeting, and everybody knew who he was,
Right.
and he was there from the government, and we never minded him, and
It's amazing.
it was interesting.
Should try to interview him, huh? If he's still here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we knew his name, and
At the time.
he
right.
was very friendly. We all knew, he knew, and we knew why he was there.
Right. Everybody understood.
Right,
Yeah, that's amazing,
right,
isn't it? Did you go to the International Women's Year Conference in Houston by any chance?
Oh, yes, I did.
Okay, me too.
You come in and see my poster.
Okay, all right. Yes,
Yeah.
that was another. Why don't
Oh,
you
that
talk
was a
about that experience?
fantastic experience. It really was. Well, of course, each state had its conference.
Right.
And I recall being the treasurer of the Louisiana conference.
Okay.
And Ollie Mae Butler, who was a professor at LSU, Southern University, was co-treasurer with me. That was a whole project all by itself, but we did many good workshops in the state conference, and then we elected a delegation to go to Houston.
Right.
Oh, Houston was a wonderful experience. This sounds strange, but I recall the delegation from Alaska were Aleut Native Americans.
Amazing.
That was my first experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the diversity. Was
Right.
Wonderful.
With that
right.
level of diversity.
I know.
Right.
You're right. That's amazing.
Right.
That was fun.
Yeah.
That was fun. Are you currently involved as an activist, or how do you still be an activist?
Well,
Age takes its toll, but
I still, although I no longer get to the AUW meetings, I still am active through AAUW with the lobbying, and I keep track of the legislation.
Good.
And I've contributed to the local branch newsletter, keeping up with federal legislation.
Excellent.
And with the AUW Legal Advocacy Fund, which files lawsuits and so on, especially against universities.
Wonderful.
And so I keep the branch informed on all of those things, even though I don't get there.
Yes, excellent. So, is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to people to remember about you, or about your involvement, or about the times?
Well, I'm not sure that anything quite comes to my mind. I think that certainly I met wonderful, wonderful people. And I mean, they've been lifelong friends.
Yes.
Like Roberta Madden and Kim Gandy, who was just a student when we first roomed together going to NOW conferences and so on. And I keep in touch peripherally in touch with Clay Latimer.
Okay.
And I'm still a member of Southern Mutual Help Association, which I met Lorna Bourg sometime around Houston. And I know we were both in Houston. And I went on the board of Southern Mutual Help in the early 80s, and I still serve.
Okay.
And I participate by Skype in all their meetings, and by conference call, and
excellent.
So I still do that.
Yeah, no, still good, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you very much for your contribution to this project. Thank you for agreeing to be interviewed, and it's great to meet you.
Very welcome.
All right. Anything else?
Not that I can think. You covered a lot of things.
Okay.
Came back to my mind.
Yeah, good.
Right,
Good.
right.